Hello. In this video, we're going to show you how to make two different functions. This time we're going to have functions, or user-defined functions, that take an actual input from our user, run some calculations, and then give something back out in the spreadsheet in one of the spreadsheet cells. So in this example, we're going to start with a very simple formula. Right? Y equals x plus 1. Right? A very basic function. Y is what comes back to the user. X is that input to the user. X plus 1 is that calculation they do. So this is the first function we'll build, and then we'll go on and build a second function that actually takes that answer and multiplies it by another number. All right, so let's get in. The first thing we got to do is actually go back into our developer tab, developer ribbon rather, and start up Visual Basic. So when we start up Visual Basic, it pops up for us. On the left-hand side in that project window, we can see our spreadsheet we're working in here. Notice we don't have a module yet. So one thing we might have to do is go right-click again, insert module. All right, I get my module. My first step, I'm going to type in option explicit. That's going to force me to declare my variables. Again, this is very good programming practice to get in the hang of. Now we want to write our first function. So in this case, we're going to make a function, and we're going to call it add1. If you recall, we always have to put that open and close parentheses at the end. Once we hit enter, it adds the end function on below that. All right, so the other really important thing that we need to do when we first write a function is write our last line of code. The last line of code is going to be what we output back to the user. So in this case, it has to be the same name as the function. So we're going to just say add1, and we're going to start out by setting that equal to 1. All right, so this is going to help us test whether our function is working properly. It's always good to kind of go back and forth from the VBA, from this Visual Basic editor we're in now, back to the spreadsheet to make sure things are working as we expect them to. So let's flip right back. I'm going to overwrite our formula here and type add1. All right, we put that in there, and we get the value 1. That's what we told it to give back. Essentially this, when we're in the VBA code, this add1 line is saying that what the y is equal to, right? We had y equals x plus 1. Add 1 is how we're representing that y. So if we want to change this instead to where the user gets back 100, right? We now have add 1 equals 100. If we flip back, go back into our cell, notice that it hasn't recalculated yet. We have to trigger it to recalculate, so I hit F2 to go into the function, hit enter. Now it shows me that value of 100. All right, so that's how we're going to update the function. But now we got to actually take some input in from the user. So let's flip back again. And now this is what goes inside these two parentheses. So inside the parentheses is where we basically define new variables that the user gives us, and then we define what type of variable they are. So in this case, I'm going to call our variable the input number. This is the x in the formula y equals x plus 1. So x is going to be the input number from our user, and we're going to define it as an integer. So notice that I start typing in. When I type that, it starts to bring up suggestions. In this case, I do want it to be an integer. I'm just going to hit tab to finish that off. And now we've defined our input that the user is going to give us as an integer, right? This is a number that can be, 1, 2, 3 whole numbers. They can also be negative, -1, -2, -3. So it defines it as a number that can only be those things. So if you put 3.5 in, it's going to have to translate that 3.5 into something other than 3.5 because it's expecting an integer as the input number there. All right, so let's see what happened to our function, and let's go back to our Excel spreadsheet. So when we come back, I'm going to hit F2, and I'm going to hit enter again. Now we see a value error. This tells us that something's going wrong in our function. In this case, we're getting a value error because it expects to get an input, but we haven't given it anything. What we have in parentheses is blank. So now this kind of triggers us. Let's go try to figure out what's wrong. In this case, let's put the number 1 in there. All right, so we add 1, we put 1 in, we hit enter, and now our function works. At least it returns a value to us. The value here is 100. Right? It's not yet x plus 1 because we haven't built that into our function. So as we return to our function, we see all it's doing is it's taking add1 is equal to 100. If we want to incorporate the input number, or that x in our formula, we have to copy that, and we have to build it into the calculation. So now we're going to change this add1 function to be equal to input number, whatever it is the user gives us, plus 1. All right. Now we've actually built our function. We've got an input coming in from the user, and we've done a calculation, and hopefully it's going out to the user properly. So let's go see what's happening. So we flip back over, go back into our function, add 1, hit enter. Now we see 2. Let's test it a bit more. Let's throw in 10. 10 plus 1 should give us 11. There we go. So it seems like we're getting good values so far from our function. Now let's see what happens if we give it things that the function doesn't necessarily expect. So for example, the example from earlier is what if we put in something like 3.5? All right, if we put in 3.5, let's see what answer we get. We get 5. All right, so 3.5 plus 1 is not equal to 5. It's equal to 4.5. So there's some conversion here happening where that 3.5 is being converted to a 4. And again, that's because of the variable type we had. We started out with as an integer. Right, that integer, again, is only whole numbers. If instead we want to allow for decimals, well, we can use a data type called double. Double means double precision. It has to do with how it's stored in the computer. For the purposes of what we're doing today, you just need to know that if you want a decimal number to be allowed, double is the type we're going to use. So now input number as double, we make that change. We come back to our function, and now it works. Now it gives us that 4.5. Let's change it up a little bit more. Let's type hello, right? We're putting a word in where it expects a number. So let's see what happens. Now we get a value error. And that's because we're expecting a double, a number, and instead it's getting a word in. And it doesn't know how to take a word and add 1 to it. So we get an error there. This is kind of beyond the scope of what we're at right now. We could do some error handling to force the user to give us something that's workable. For now, we're just going to know that that's an error that might clue us into that we're giving the wrong variable type into the function. So let's back up, and let's flip this back to the number 10.